The sepia tones of the 1895 wedding photograph shimmered with an almost ethereal glow, capturing a moment frozen in time, seemingly perfect, eternally blissful. A handsome groom, impeccably dressed in his finest mourning coat, stood beside a radiant bride, her eyes sparkling with youthful hope beneath a delicate lace veil. Their hands were clasped, a symbol of their newly forged union, their smiles wide and unwavering for the camera's unblinking eye. Every detail, from the intricate floral arrangements to the dignified expressions of the assembled family members, spoke of prosperity, respectability, and a future brimming with promise. It was, by all accounts, the quintessential image of a grand Victorian wedding, a testament to love, commitment, and the harmonious blending of two respected families. Yet, as the lens clicked shut, sealing that idyllic scene forever into history, a profound and insidious lie had already taken root, festering beneath the groom's polished veneer. At that precise, celebrated instant, his heart harbored a secret so dark, so utterly corrosive, that it rendered the entire foundation of their sacred vows a profound, calculated deception. This was no mere oversight, no youthful indiscretion easily forgiven. This was a deliberate, intricate betrayal, a carefully constructed edifice of falsehood built upon the innocent trust of a young woman and her family. The offense was his premeditated dishonesty, a calculated act of manipulation that twisted every genuine smile, every heartfelt blessing within that frame, into a mockery, tainting the very air that surrounded them. The joyous celebration, in truth, was merely the elaborate stage for a monumental deceit, a performance designed to secure a future built on a foundation of sand and lies. When the truth, in its own slow and agonizing manner, finally began to unravel, the initial shock that ripped through our small community was a palpable force, a collective gasp echoing through the hushed parlors and bustling market squares. Disbelief clung to the air like a heavy shroud, a desperate attempt to deny the impossible, to cling to the comforting illusion of what we thought we knew. Yet, amidst the ensuing chaos, the whispered rumors, and the open expressions of outrage, a surprising calm settled within me, a quiet, almost unnerving composure that defied the expectations of the era. This was not the stunned paralysis of a victim, nor the hysterical outburst of a woman scorned. Instead, it was a strategic stillness, a hardening of resolve forged in the crucible of overwhelming deceit. It was the quiet strength of someone who had seen the deepest shadows, and rather than cowering, had chosen to meet them with an unwavering gaze. This tranquil determination was a shield, a promise to myself that though the world might crumble around me, I would stand firm, resolute in my pursuit of understanding and ultimately justice. It was a strength that ran deeper than societal graces, a quiet defiance born from the ashes of shattered trust. The grand consequence of his monumental deception, though still largely veiled in the mists of an uncertain future, had already begun its slow, relentless march. The first tremors were almost imperceptible. Subtle shifts in the social landscape, a sudden, unexpected disruption to the groom's carefully constructed facade, a fleeting moment of public doubt, a hushed conversation abruptly silenced upon his approach, a flicker of suspicion in the eyes of an acquaintance previously loyal. These were the nascent stages of an intricate unraveling, the very first cracks appearing in the impenetrable armor of his carefully cultivated image. The full, devastating impact remained shrouded, a promise of future reckoning that hung heavy in the air, building an inescapable suspense that gripped those few who sensed the impending storm. The polished veneer of that photograph would soon crack, revealing the rot beneath, and justice, though slow, was already stirring, a relentless force gathering momentum in the quiet corners of our world, preparing to exact its inevitable toll. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are watching from in the comments. The year 1895 was a tapestry woven with threads of rigid expectation and unyielding social decorum. It was a world where a woman's destiny was largely sealed by the marriage she made, where reputation was a currency more valuable than gold, and where appearances were everything. In the close-knit communities that dotted the landscape, Everyone knew everyone, or at least everyone believed they did. Gossip, though often whispered behind cupped hands, traveled with the speed of a telegram, shaping destinies and cementing social standing. For young women, the pressure to secure a good match was immense, a silent but omnipresent force guiding every interaction, every smile, every carefully chosen word. To fail in this endeavor was not merely a personal disappointment, it was a societal failing, a mark of shame that could shadow a family for generations. Within such a world, the prospective union of Eleanor Vance and Thomas Atherton was, on the surface, a triumph of societal aspiration. Eleanor's family, the Vances, were pillars of their community, respected, traditional, their roots deeply entwined with the very fabric of the town. They were known for their unshakable integrity, their quiet generosity, and perhaps a touch of an old-fashioned naivete that made them overly trusting of outward displays of prosperity and charm. They saw in Thomas Atherton everything a father could wish for his daughter: ambition, success, and a seemingly impeccable lineage. Thomas's family, the Athertons, carried a different air. They were newer money, perhaps, but undeniably well-established. Their name invoked with a certain reverence in business circles. They exuded an aura of quiet power, a sophisticated detachment that many mistook for refined elegance. Yet, there were subtle hints, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, of an underlying ambition that bordered on ruthlessness, a guardedness that kept true feelings and intentions carefully veiled. Thomas himself was the epitome of the era's ideal gentleman. Tall, impeccably dressed, with a smile that could disarm the most cautious of souls, he possessed a charisma that drew people in like moths to a flame. He was articulate, witty, and seemingly devoted to Eleanor, a catch by every conceivable social standard. His success in the burgeoning industrial landscape was widely admired, solidifying his position as a coveted bachelor. Yet even in the early days of their courtship, before the engagement was formally announced, before the wedding plans consumed every waking moment, faint discord began to hum beneath the surface of this idyllic picture. They were fleeting moments, easily dismissed, almost too subtle to register as anything more than minor peculiarities. Eleanor's Aunt Clara, a woman whose keen eyes missed nothing and whose tongue was rarely idle, once remarked, after an evening spent with Thomas, that he had a convenient memory regarding certain aspects of his past business dealings. It was a comment quickly smoothed over by Eleanor's mother, who attributed it to Clara's usual cynicism. Then there were Thomas's unexplained absences, always accounted for with plausible, if vague, business trips to distant cities. He was a busy man, everyone reasoned, building an empire for his future bride. Eleanor's closest confidant, her cousin Lily, a spirited girl with an uncanny intuition, once confessed a strange, cold discomfort in Thomas's presence, a feeling she couldn't quite name. She described it as a faint chill that settled over her whenever he entered the room, a feeling that contradicted his warm demeanor. But Eleanor, blinded by the glow of impending marriage and the validation it brought, had simply laughed it off, attributing it to Lily's overactive imagination. For Eleanor, the initial feelings were a tumultuous blend of breathless excitement and the profound societal validation that came with securing such a desirable match. The prospect of a grand wedding, the envy in the eyes of her peers, the pride in her parents' faces. It was everything she had been raised to aspire to. She loved Thomas, or at least she believed she did, swept away by his charm and the sheer force of his presence. Yet beneath the veneer of this joyous anticipation, a quiet unease began to stir within her, a premonition she struggled to articulate, even to herself. It was a faint, almost imperceptible shadow that danced at the edges of her consciousness, a discordant note in the otherwise perfect symphony of her engagement. It was the feeling that something, somewhere, was not quite right, a whisper of doubt that she, in her eagerness to embrace her future, desperately tried to silence. This nascent apprehension was a seed, planted in the fertile ground of her subconscious, destined to grow into a formidable, inescapable truth. She pushed it down, attributing it to pre-wedding nerves, to the overwhelming changes in her life, to anything but the unsettling possibility that the man she was to marry harbored a secret darker than any she could possibly imagine. Her heart longed for the fairy tale, but her gut, a quiet, insistent oracle, already sensed the approaching storm. The quiet unease that had settled in Clara's heart, a premonition she desperately tried to dismiss as mere bridal nerves, was not some baseless anxiety. It was, in truth, the faint echo of old wounds, the subtle tremor of deep-seated conflicts that had simmered beneath the genteel surface of their society for generations. To truly understand the deceit woven into the very fabric of that wedding photograph, Wynne had to look beyond the immediate engagement and delve into the entwined, often troubled histories of the Sterling and the Blackwood families. The Sterlings, Clara's lineage, were known for their quiet dignity, their land-rich but not ostentatious wealth, and a staunch adherence to tradition. They valued honor and sincerity above all, a trait that perhaps made them vulnerable to those who did not. Their reputation was their most guarded treasure, built on generations of honest dealings and unwavering integrity within their tight-knit community. On the other hand, the Blackwoods, Arthur's family, presented a more complex facade. They were newer money, having risen to prominence through shrewd, some might say ruthless, business ventures in the burgeoning industrial landscape. While outwardly polished and impeccably mannered, a certain whisper always followed their name, a faint suggestion of ambition that bordered on avarice, and a tendency to prioritize appearances and financial gain above genuine connection. There had been a subtle, almost forgotten rivalry between the families decades prior, concerning a disputed parcel of land that bordered both their estates. It was a legal battle quickly settled out of court, ostensibly amicably, but the memory of the Blackwoods' aggressive pursuit had left a lingering, unspoken caution in the Sterling household, a faint bruise on their collective memory. Clara's grandfather, a man of few words but sharp perception, had once remarked, "The Blackwoods never forget a slight, nor do they forgive a perceived opportunity missed." This was a family that understood the power of secrets, adept at keeping their own counsel and presenting a meticulously curated image to the world, a habit that had been passed down through their lineage like a carefully guarded heirloom. Arthur himself, the charismatic groom, was a living embodiment of this Blackwood legacy. His charm was undeniable, a polished veneer that reflected exactly what society expected: success, confidence, and a touch of daring. Yet beneath that surface, the subtle cracks had begun to form long before the engagement was even announced. Clara, in her youthful hope and the blinding glow of societal approval, had rationalized them away, seeing them as quirks rather than warnings. She remembered distinctly an afternoon tea at the Blackwood estate, months before the proposal. Arthur's Aunt Beatrice, a woman known for her sharp tongue and even sharper eyes, had made an offhand comment about Arthur's travels abroad during his university years. "He certainly saw a great deal of the world, didn't he?" she had mused, a peculiar glint in her eye as she looked at Clara. "Learned many a lesson, I'm sure." Arthur had quickly interjected, smoothly changing the subject to the new rose garden, but the memory of his aunt's lingering gaze, heavy with unsaid meaning, had stayed with Clara. At the time, she had simply thought Aunt Beatrice was eccentric, perhaps a little jealous of Arthur's bright prospects. Then there was the peculiar incident of the letter. About a year before the wedding, a thick cream-colored envelope arrived at the Sterling Manor, addressed simply to Arthur Blackwood, C.O. the Sterling family. It bore a foreign stamp, and the handwriting was elegant, feminine. Clara had innocently presented it to Arthur when he called that evening. He had taken it, his smile momentarily faltering, and quickly tucked it into his inner jacket pocket without opening it. "Business," he'd said dismissively. "Nothing for a lady to trouble her pretty head about." A fleeting shadow had crossed his face, a flicker of something unreadable before his usual charming demeanor returned. Clara, accustomed to the discreet nature of men's affairs, thought nothing more of it then, dismissing it as a matter of his burgeoning financial dealings, a world she was not expected to understand. Another memory, more unsettling in hindsight, concerned a distant cousin of Arthur's, a man named Thomas, who had appeared unexpectedly at a community gathering. Thomas, a quiet, almost reclusive scholar, had cornered Clara briefly, his eyes wide with an urgency that belied his usual reserved nature. He had begun to speak in hushed, hurried tones about Arthur, muttering something about unpaid debts and promises made under false pretenses in a town far to the north. Before he could elaborate, Arthur had suddenly appeared, a hand firmly on Thomas's shoulder, his smile tight. "Thomas, old friend, I believe the vicar is looking for you to discuss the new library acquisitions." Thomas had visibly paled, excusing himself abruptly and disappearing into the crowd, avoiding Clara's gaze for the remainder of the evening. Arthur had then laughed, explaining Thomas was a bit of an odd duck, prone to flights of fancy and prone to exaggerating minor financial disagreements. Clara, caught in the social whirl and eager to believe the best of her fiancé, had accepted his explanation, albeit with a tiny, persistent prickle of doubt. These were the subtle cracks, the faint dissonances in the symphony of their courtship. Each time, Clara's intuition had whispered a warning, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor in the carefully constructed reality. Yet, the immense weight of societal expectation, the pervasive narrative of a perfect match, and her own deep desire for a future she had been taught to aspire to, had compelled her to ignore these nascent fears. The pressure to secure a good union, to fulfill her role as a woman of her standing, was a powerful force, capable of silencing even the most insistent internal alarms. She had been so eager to see the man she loved, the man she was promised to in the most favorable light, to believe in the grand narrative of their love story. These early indicators, dismissed as trivial or misunderstood as eccentricities, were in fact the first threads of the complex web of deceit that would ultimately unravel, not just a wedding, but the very fabric of their carefully ordered lives. The desire for a perfect union had blinded them all, allowing the insidious conflict to fester, slowly, quietly, beneath the surface of polite society, preparing for its inevitable, explosive emergence. The desire for a perfect union had indeed blinded them all, allowing the insidious conflict to fester, slowly, quietly, beneath the surface of polite society, preparing for its inevitable, explosive emergence. Arthur's courtship, initially a whirlwind of flattering attention and eloquent promises, had begun to reveal its true, more tarnished hues not in grand, dramatic gestures, but in a series of small, almost imperceptible episodes that, over time, chipped away at Clara's initial perception of him. He was a master of charm, his words always perfectly chosen, his smile disarmingly sincere, yet a pattern of manipulation and subtle disrespect slowly, insidiously, began to etch itself into the fabric of their relationship. One evening, Arthur had promised to accompany her to a charity ball, an event Clara had eagerly anticipated, having chosen her gown weeks in advance. Hours before they were due to depart, a messenger arrived with a terse note, explaining that an urgent, unforeseen business matter required his immediate attention out of town. Clara was left to attend with her aunt, feeling a profound sense of disappointment and a faint, nagging confusion. When Arthur returned days later, he offered a profusion of apologies, painting a vivid picture of a perilous financial negotiation that had saved his family from ruin, making her feel selfish for her trivial disappointment. He spoke of the heavy burdens of a man of his standing, implying her lack of understanding. The lie, if it was one, was so intricately woven with plausible detail and self-sacrificing heroism that Clara felt a pang of guilt for even a flicker of doubt. Yet, a seed of unease was planted, a quiet question mark beside his otherwise impeccable character. There were other, more personal instances. Arthur often spoke of their future, painting glorious visions of a grand home, philanthropic endeavors, and a life of shared intellectual pursuits. He would mention a substantial inheritance he was soon to receive, a legacy that would secure their prosperity beyond measure. However, when Clara innocently inquired about the specifics, perhaps about the location of this future estate or the nature of the investments, His answers would become vague, evasive, sometimes even slightly irritated. "My dear, these are matters for men of business," he would gently chide. "Your beautiful mind should concern itself with poetry and gardens, not the dreary ledgers of finance." He would then distract her with a compliment, a tender touch, or a passionate declaration of love, making her feel foolish for pressing the point. These dismissive gestures, though cloaked in affection, were subtle aggressions, designed to make her doubt her own right to inquire, to make her feel that her concerns were unfounded or unfeminine. The most insidious of his tactics was his mastery of gaslighting. Clara might recall a conversation where Arthur had made a specific promise, perhaps to introduce her to a particular influential family, or to attend a specific social engagement. When the time came, and the promise remained unfulfilled, and Clara would gently remind him, he would look at her with an expression of genuine bewilderment. "My dearest, I truly do not recall such a conversation," he would say, his brow furrowed with concern. "Are you certain you are not mistaken? Perhaps you dreamt it or confused it with something another gentleman mentioned." He would then subtly imply that she was prone to flights of fancy, or that her memory was not as sharp as it once was, making her question her own sanity. Clara would find herself backtracking, apologizing, feeling a profound sense of confusion and self-doubt. Her intuition, once a clear voice, began to feel like a faulty instrument, unreliable and prone to error. These quiet criticisms, delivered with a soft smile or a concerned gaze, were far more damaging than any overt outburst. He would subtly undermine her confidence in her own judgments, her taste in books, or her opinions on social matters, always framing it as helpful guidance, a gentle shaping of her character for their shared future. "That particular novel is perhaps a little too modern for a lady of your refined sensibilities," he might suggest. Or, "While your opinion is charmingly spirited, perhaps a more circumspect view would be better received in polite company." He was slowly, imperceptibly isolating her from her own inner compass, making her increasingly dependent on his approval and validation. The slow corrosion of trust was not a sudden dramatic event, but an insidious process, like rust eating away at finely wrought iron. Clara found herself in a relationship that felt increasingly hollow, unsettling, yet she was bound by the immense weight of societal expectations. Her days were filled with the meticulous preparations for the wedding, the endless fittings, the guest lists, the social calls, all while her internal world was quietly fracturing. The initial joy and hopeful anticipation had been replaced by a persistent, low-grade anxiety. She felt a continuous drain on her emotional well-being, a sense of being perpetually off balance, as if walking on shifting sands. She would lie awake at night, replaying conversations, searching for definitive proof of her unease, only to find herself caught in a labyrinth of Arthur's plausible excuses and her own self-doubt. The man she was supposed to marry, the man who was to be her protector and companion, was becoming a stranger, a charming enigma whose true nature remained just out of reach, shrouded in a mist of half-truths and unspoken intentions. Yet to voice these nascent fears, to articulate the subtle manipulations and the creeping disrespect, felt impossible. How could she explain to her family, to her friends, to a society that saw Arthur as an ideal catch, that her fiancé's charm felt like a gilded cage? How could she describe the feeling of her own spirit slowly dimming under the weight of his calculated affection? She was trapped, not by chains, but by the invisible, yet unbreakable bonds of expectation, and a fear of disrupting the perfect narrative that had been so carefully constructed around her impending union. The wedding, once a beacon of her future, now loomed, a grand, inevitable stage for a performance she was no longer certain she wished to be a part of. The unsettling truth was that the charming facade of Arthur, the man everyone admired, was slowly, painfully eroding the very essence of Clara's trust and peace of mind. As the calendar pages turned with an almost cruel rapidity, bringing the fateful wedding day ever closer, the polite discussions surrounding Arthur and Clara's impending nuptials began to fray at the edges. revealing the raw nerves beneath. The quiet doubts that had once been mere flickers in the minds of a few discerning relatives now intensified, blossoming into more direct, albeit still carefully worded concerns. Family dinners, once occasions for joyous planning and excited anticipation, transformed into arenas of unspoken tension. Clara's mother, usually the picture of steadfast optimism, found her smile growing thinner, her reassurances to Clara sounding increasingly hollow, even to her own ears. She would catch herself watching Arthur, a new speculative glint in her eyes, whenever he spoke of his business ventures or his future plans, a vigilance that had been absent before. Her Aunt Beatrice, a woman known for her sharp intellect and even sharper tongue, was no longer content with subtle hints. Over a cup of tea one afternoon, she had leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "Clara, my dear, one cannot ignore the whispers forever. This talk of Arthur's dealings in the north, and that poor Thomas, disappearing so suddenly after his brief reappearance, it all paints a rather troubling picture, does it not?" Clara's father, however, remained resolute, his pride in the match and his desire for his daughter's security overriding any nascent misgivings. He dismissed Beatrice's concerns as old wives' tales and idle gossip, stressing the importance of upholding their family's reputation and the sanctity of the agreement. His insistence, meant to be reassuring, only served to deepen Clara's sense of isolation, making her feel as though her own growing anxieties were unfounded, even disloyal. The pressure within the family to present a united, unblemished front to society became an almost suffocating force, pushing genuine concerns further into the shadows. In a community as close-knit as theirs, where lives intertwined like threads in a finely woven tapestry, secrets rarely remained so for long. The subtle shifts within the bride's family did not go unnoticed. Whispers, like tendrils of smoke, began to curl through drawing rooms and across garden fences, carried on the breeze of casual conversation. The ladies at the weekly tea circle, usually engaged in polite chatter about seasonal fashions or parish news, would now exchange knowing glances when Arthur's name was mentioned. Their conversations would pause, then resume with an almost exaggerated enthusiasm for a different topic, leaving Clara's family acutely aware of the unspoken judgments. The vicar's wife, a woman usually a fount of benign pleasantries and comforting platitudes, grew uncharacteristically quiet in Clara's presence, her gaze lingering a moment too long, a silent question in her eyes. Every outing felt like walking a gauntlet of silent scrutiny, the weight of their collective judgment, almost a physical presence, a suffocating blanket of suspicion that followed Clara and her family wherever they went. The idyllic vision of the impending wedding, once a source of communal celebration, was slowly being tarnished by the insidious creep of public doubt, creating an external pressure that amplified the internal turmoil. For Clara, the once vibrant tapestry of her engagement had become a heavy, suffocating shroud. The shimmering gown, once a symbol of dreams and a joyful future, now felt like a heavy, inescapable garment, its delicate lace a constricting net. The joyous anticipation that had once filled her heart had transformed into a profound and pervasive sense of dread, a cold knot in her stomach that tightened with each passing day. She found herself increasingly alone in her burgeoning fears. Her mother, while showing signs of worry, still clung to the hope of a perfect union, swayed by her husband's insistence and the sheer momentum of the grand preparations. Her friends, caught up in the romance of the occasion, either dismissed her vague anxieties as pre-wedding jitters or were too focused on the spectacle to truly listen. Arthur, when confronted with her anxieties, would skillfully deflect, charming her with renewed promises of devotion, or subtly gaslighting her into believing her worries were baseless, a product of an overactive imagination. "My dearest Clara," he would say, his voice a soothing balm, "you allow the idle chatter of others to disturb your peace. Our love is stronger than any whisper." Her childhood home, once a sanctuary of comfort and affection, had warped into a gilded cage. The air within its walls, once light and filled with laughter, now felt thick with unspoken anxieties, the tension palpable in the strained smiles and hurried movements of her parents. Clara would lie awake at night, staring into the darkness, the silence amplifying the frantic beat of her own heart. Sleep offered little respite. Haunted by fragmented memories of Arthur's evasions, Thomas's panicked warning, and the cold, assessing glances of the community, she felt trapped, not just by the societal expectations that bound her to this marriage, but by the relentless march of time towards a day she now dreaded more than anything. The weight of her family's reputation, the immense financial investment in the wedding, and the sheer societal scandal that would erupt if she were to call it off, pressed down on her with an unbearable force. She was a bird caught in a net, watching the hunter approach, unable to cry out, unable to escape, her once bright future dissolving into a chilling premonition of despair. The joy of being a bride had vanished, replaced by a suffocating burden, as she felt increasingly isolated in her terrifying suspicions, a lone voice against a chorus of hopeful denial and rigid expectation. The desire for a perfect union had blinded them all, allowing the insidious conflict to fester, slowly, quietly, beneath the surface of polite society, preparing for its inevitable explosive emergence. As the final weeks dwindled, drawing closer to the grand day, the veneer Arthur so meticulously maintained began to crack, not in subtle fissures, but in stark, undeniable fractures. His usual charming composure, once an impenetrable shield, now faltered under the slightest provocation, revealing glimpses of a volatile temperament Clara had never before witnessed. One evening, during a dinner gathering meant to celebrate the impending nuptials, a seemingly innocuous comment from a distant cousin about a recent downturn in the cotton market sent Arthur into a sudden, shocking rage. He slammed his fist on the table, silencing the room, his face contorted in a mask of fury that was utterly alien to the man Clara thought she knew. He spat out a harsh retort, accusing the cousin of spreading malicious gossip, his eyes blazing with an intensity that sent a shiver down Clara's spine. The outburst was brief, quickly smoothed over by apologies and nervous laughter, but the memory lingered, a stark, ugly stain on the polished evening. It was no longer a matter of a bit of an odd duck or minor financial disagreements. This was a raw, untamed aggression, a glimpse into a darkness she had instinctively shied away from acknowledging. Beyond these unsettling emotional displays, Arthur's financial dealings, once a discreet mystery, began to bleed into public knowledge, no longer confined to hushed whispers. A prominent local merchant, Mr. Davies, a man known for his unimpeachable integrity, approached Clara's father one afternoon, his brow furrowed with concern. He spoke in guarded tones of a significant debt Arthur owed him, a sum far larger than previously disclosed, and one that Arthur had been unusually evasive about repaying. Mr. Davies mentioned a series of promissory notes, some with questionable dates, others seemingly signed under duress, all pointing to a desperate man playing a dangerous game. The conversation, though brief and indirect, reached Clara's ears through her mother's anxious recounting. Her father, usually so robust and confident, seemed to shrink under the weight of this new information, his trust in his future son-in-law visibly eroding. The financial discrepancies were no longer vague hints. They were concrete, unsettling facts that hinted at a far more serious instability than anyone had dared to imagine. Arthur's recklessness was no longer just emotional. It was material, threatening to unravel not just his own reputation, but potentially Clara's family's standing as well. Then came the undeniable lie, a blatant falsehood Clara herself stumbled upon. Driven by a burgeoning unease she could no longer suppress, a desperate need for clarity, she had begun to subtly question some of Arthur's more elaborate stories. He had often spoken of a grand estate he was set to inherit from a distant uncle in the countryside, a property that would secure their future in opulent comfort. One afternoon, while visiting a family friend who possessed an extensive knowledge of local land deeds and genealogies, Clara casually inquired about this particular estate and the uncle Arthur had described. The friend, a kind elderly woman with a sharp memory, looked at Clara with a puzzled expression. "My dear," she said gently, "I know of no such estate, nor any uncle of Arthur's with such holdings. His family line is well documented in these parts, and there is no record of any such inheritance. Perhaps you misunderstood? The words hit Clara with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a fabrication, a deliberate deception designed to impress and secure. The grand estate, the comfortable future, it was all a house of cards. The shame, the humiliation, the profound betrayal she felt in that moment was suffocating. This accumulation of brazen acts, the public display of temper, the undeniable financial impropriety, and the outright lie, stripped away the last vestiges of Clara's patience. The quiet unease had morphed into a roaring alarm, the passive doubt into an urgent, desperate need for truth. The hope for a perfect union, for the man she believed Arthur to be, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Her denial, once a comforting blanket, now felt like a suffocating shroud. She could no longer simply dismiss these red flags as eccentricities or unfortunate misunderstandings. They were deliberate deceptions, carefully constructed illusions designed to ensnare her and her family. The internal conflict shifted dramatically. No longer was she merely observing, passively enduring the growing dread. A steely resolve began to harden within her, a fierce determination to uncover the full extent of Arthur's duplicity, no matter the social cost, no matter the scandal it might ignite. She was no longer a naive young woman bound by societal expectations. She was a woman on the precipice of a monumental discovery, driven by a raw, unyielding need to understand the true nature of the man she was about to marry. The atmosphere in the household became thick with unspoken tension, a palpable sense of impending doom hanging over every interaction. The once joyful anticipation of the wedding had curdled into a heavy dread, a collective anxiety that permeated the very air. Clara moved through her days with a heightened sense of awareness, her senses acutely tuned to every whisper, every guarded glance, every subtle shift in conversation. She began to discreetly question trusted servants, to subtly probe family acquaintances, piecing together fragments of information, each revelation a fresh sting, a deepening wound. The wedding, now just days away, no longer felt like a joyous celebration, but a looming stage, meticulously set for a catastrophic unraveling. The elaborate preparations, the beautiful gown, the carefully chosen flowers, all seemed to mock the profound deceit lurking beneath the surface. It was clear to anyone paying attention that the carefully constructed facade, the illusion of a perfect match, was stretched to its absolute limit, ready to tear apart with an explosive force. The collision was not just possible, it was inevitable, a ticking clock counting down to the moment the truth would burst forth, irrevocably altering the course of their lives and shattering the delicate peace of their small, watchful community. The day of the wedding dawned with an unsettling brightness, a stark contrast to the storm brewing beneath the surface of Clara's composure. Every detail, from the delicate lace of her gown to the fragrant lilies adorning the church, felt like a cruel mockery of the profound deceit she knew was about to be unmasked. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of dread and anticipation. She walked down the aisle, her father's arm a steady anchor, but her gaze was fixed, not on the man waiting at the altar, but on the faces in the pews, searching for any sign, any indication that the truth was already known. Arthur stood there, a picture of conventional elegance, his smile unwavering, his eyes holding a familiar, unsettling glint of self-satisfaction. He was oblivious, or perhaps simply arrogant enough to believe his carefully constructed lies would hold. The ceremony began with the usual solemnity, the hushed reverence of a community gathered to witness a sacred union. The minister's voice, a gentle drone, seemed to fade into the background as Clara's mind raced, replaying every whispered rumor, every suspicious glance, every fragment of information she had painstakingly gathered. She had dispatched a trusted, discreet family friend to the distant town Arthur had vaguely mentioned as his birthplace, a place she now knew held more than just childhood memories. The friend had returned late the previous night, exhausted but with a grim determination in his eyes, clutching a small, aged leather-bound ledger and a faded tin-type photograph. The evidence was damning, irrefutable, and utterly devastating. Clara had spent the remaining hours of the night wrestling with the implications, with the monumental decision that lay before her. To expose Arthur meant public scandal, social ruin, and the shattering of her family's carefully maintained reputation. To remain silent meant a life built on a lie, a marriage to a man whose very existence was a cruel deception. As the minister reached the pivotal vows, the air in the church thickened, charged with an invisible tension. Clara felt a strange, almost out-of-body sensation, as if she were watching a play unfold, a drama in which she was both the unwilling protagonist and the silent observer. Arthur began to speak his vows, his voice smooth and confident, promising fidelity and devotion. Clara's gaze drifted past him, past the ornate altar, and settled on the large stained glass window, depicting a scene of biblical judgment. It was then, just as Arthur finished his final empty pledge, that a rustle broke the hushed silence. A woman, small and unassuming, dressed in plain, dark attire, rose slowly from a back pew. In her arms she held a child, a little boy of perhaps 3 years, with wide, innocent eyes and a shock of dark, curly hair that mirrored Arthur's own. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation, a wave of shocked whispers that quickly escalated into an audible murmur. Every head turned, every eye fixated on the unexpected apparition. The woman, her face pale but resolute, began to walk slowly down the aisle, her gaze unwavering as she approached the altar. The child, sensing the shift in atmosphere, began to whimper softly, burying his face into his mother's shoulder. Arthur, his back to the aisle, remained oblivious for a moment, his smile still fixed, waiting for Clara to respond. It was only when the minister, his face etched with confusion and alarm, cleared his throat loudly that Arthur finally turned. His eyes, once so self-assured, widened in a flicker of pure, unadulterated terror as he recognized the woman and the child. The color drained from his face, leaving it a ghastly white. "Arthur!" The woman's voice was clear, though trembling slightly, carrying through the stunned silence. "You cannot marry this woman. You are already married, to me. And this," she gently pushed the child forward slightly, "is your son, Thomas." Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, reverberating through the sacred space. The effect was immediate and devastating. The entire wedding, the meticulously planned celebration of love and union, collapsed in an instant. Gasps turned into cries of outrage, whispers into indignant shouts. Clara's mother, standing beside her, let out a choked sob, her hand flying to her mouth. Her father's grip on her arm tightened, his knuckles white. The guests, once a picture of polite society, dissolved into a chaotic tableau of shock, anger, and horrified fascination. Arthur, for his part, stood frozen, caught in the headlights of his own monstrous lie. His carefully constructed facade, the polished veneer of respectability he had so painstakingly maintained, shattered into a million fragments around him. He stammered, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, no coherent words emerging. The minister, regaining his composure, stepped forward, his voice stern, demanding an explanation. But no explanation could possibly suffice. The evidence was living, breathing, and undeniable, standing right there in the aisle, a testament to his profound betrayal. The small, unassuming woman, his legal wife, and their son, his legitimate heir, had arrived to claim their rightful place, exposing him for the fraud he truly was. Clara felt a strange mix of emotions. There was the searing pain of betrayal, a deep ache in her chest, but beneath it, a surge of vindication, a chilling confirmation of every gut feeling, every nagging doubt she had tried to suppress. The suffocating weight of dread that had plagued her for weeks lifted, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. This public humiliation, this devastating scandal, was the price of his deception, and she would not be the one to pay it in silence. Her world, once defined by the impending marriage, was irrevocably changed, redirected in a single, shattering instant. The future she had envisioned, the life she had planned, vanished like smoke, replaced by a terrifying yet strangely liberating blank canvas. The shame was immense. Yes, but it was Arthur's shame, not hers. The chaos that erupted around her, the cacophony of shocked voices, the stunned faces of her family and friends, all faded into a distant hum. Her eyes met Arthur's, still wide with panic, and in that moment, she saw not the charming suitor, but the hollowed, deceitful man he truly was. The dark secret once hidden behind his confident smile in that innocent-looking photograph had exploded into the harsh light of day, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. The wedding, meant to be a joyous beginning, had become the definitive turning point, a public execution of a lie, and the unexpected, painful birth of Clara's true path. The ticking clock indeed reached its final second. The morning of the wedding dawned, not with the joyous peal of church bells, but with the thunderous arrival of an official summons, delivered directly to the family estate. It was not merely a social slight, but a legal document, a warrant for Arthur's arrest, issued on charges of grand fraud and bigamy. The dark secret, hinted at in whispers and obscured by his charm, exploded into the open with devastating clarity. Arthur, it turned out, was not only deeply indebted to several unsavory characters, having squandered a phantom inheritance, but he had also, just 3 years prior, married a woman in a distant county, abandoning her and their infant son shortly thereafter. The grand estate he boasted of inheriting was a mirage, his wealth a carefully constructed fabrication, built on the backs of defrauded investors and a cruelly discarded family. The wedding ceremony, meant to be the pinnacle of his social ascent, became the stage for his most spectacular and public downfall. Chaos erupted. The assembled guests, initially murmuring with confusion, quickly devolved into gasps of horror and outrage as the details spread like wildfire through the hushed halls. Clara's father, his face ashen, confronted Arthur, who, stripped of his composure, could only offer desperate, pathetic denials, his once charming facade crumbling into a mask of fear and desperation. The bride, Clara, stood transfixed, her beautiful gown suddenly feeling like a heavy shroud, her heart an aching void. The man she was about to pledge her life to was not merely flawed. He was a criminal, a deceitful monster who had woven a web of lies so intricate and cruel that it defied belief. Her world, meticulously planned and dreamed, imploded in that instant, leaving behind only the bitter taste of betrayal and the chilling realization of how close she had come to a lifetime of utter misery. The whispers that followed Arthur's unceremonious removal were not of sympathy, but of condemnation, his name now synonymous with disgrace. His carefully cultivated reputation, the very foundation of his social standing, was not merely tarnished, it was utterly obliterated, crushed beneath the weight of his own monstrous deceit. Public ostracization was immediate and absolute, his family, though initially complicit in their silence, now recoiling in horror from the fallout. Legal repercussions followed swiftly, ensuring his descent into ignominy and a future behind bars. For Clara, the immediate aftermath was a blur of shock and profound grief, not for the man she had lost, but for the life that had been stolen from her. The grand wedding was called off, of course, the elaborate preparations dismantled, each discarded flower and folded linen a poignant reminder of the shattered dream. The community, once watchful and gossipy, now offered a strange mix of pity and veiled judgment. Some whispered about her naivete, others about the shame brought upon her family. But beneath it all, a quiet respect began to form for her family's swift and decisive action in exposing the truth. Clara retreated, not into despair, but into a deep introspective silence, processing the magnitude of the betrayal. It was a long, arduous journey of rebuilding, not a quick recovery. The anger was a burning ember, the hurt a constant ache, but slowly, painstakingly, she began to sift through the wreckage of her expectations. She found solace in her family's unwavering support, their love a balm to her wounded spirit. She began to read voraciously, to engage in intellectual pursuits previously deemed unsuitable for a young woman of her station. Her mind, once preoccupied with societal expectations, now craved knowledge and understanding, a new kind of freedom. Years passed, transforming the heartbroken bride into a woman of remarkable strength and independence, a testament to enduring truth over deceit. She embraced a life far different from the one planned, one not defined by a husband or a grand estate, but by her own intellect and quiet resolve. She never married, choosing instead a path of self-sufficiency, dedicating her energies to charitable work and supporting women's education, becoming a respected, if unconventional, figure in her community. Her story became one of resilience, a quiet triumph of the human spirit. The scandal faded into local legend, a cautionary tale whispered through generations. But Clara's quiet dignity and unwavering commitment to her own truth ensured her legacy was one of integrity, not victimhood. She had reclaimed her own narrative not as the jilted bride, but as the woman who had faced profound betrayal and emerged stronger, wiser, and more authentically herself. Her peace was hard won, a vindication of her refusal to live a lie. The 1895 wedding picture, once a symbol of a beautiful beginning, now hung in the family archive, a stark, silent testament to the devastating power of appearances versus reality. The handsome groom, with his deceptive smile, was forever frozen in time, his dark secret now the defining feature of his legacy, his fate a grim reminder of the cost of deceit. But for Clara, the photograph held a different meaning. It was a symbol of her escape, a silent marker of the moment her life was irrevocably redirected, away from a gilded cage and towards a future she forged with her own hands. It represented the quiet power of finding one's own truth, even when that truth was painful and disruptive. The long shadow of secrets had indeed cast its pall, but the human spirit's capacity for survival and renewal had ultimately prevailed. As the years turned into decades, Clara would sometimes gaze at that faded image, not with bitterness, but with a profound, contemplative silence, understanding the complex nature of justice and the deep, abiding peace that comes from healing, not through forgetting, but through living a life truly and bravely. Her journey, born from betrayal, had ultimately led her to an unexpected, profound freedom. The sepia-toned photograph, fragile with the weight of decades, presents a tableau of frozen perfection from the year 1895. Within its aged frame, a scene of quintessential Victorian romance unfolds. A groom, impossibly handsome in his sharply tailored suit, his gaze direct and confident, stands beside his bride, a vision of demure beauty swathed in white lace and silk. Her eyes, lowered in a gesture of maidenly grace, conceal a nascent joy, while her delicate hand rests lightly on his arm, a symbol of innocent trust. The setting, an ornate drawing room adorned with cascading floral arrangements and heavy velvet drapes, speaks volumes of status and impeccable taste. Every detail, from the pearl buttons on her gown to the polished gleam of his patent leather shoes, was meticulously curated to project an image of a flawless union, a future brimming with prosperity and unblemished happiness. Yet, at the very precise moment the photographer's flash momentarily illuminated that carefully constructed scene, the groom harbored a secret so profoundly dark, so utterly corrosive, that it rendered the entire sacred union a profound, calculated lie. The smile playing on his lips, so convincing to the casual observer, was in truth a thinly veiled mask, a chilling testament to a betrayal that ran deeper than any casual observer could ever fathom. This was not a mere oversight, a youthful error, or a misunderstanding born of circumstance. This was a deliberate, meticulously planned deception, an act of calculated malice designed to ensnare and exploit. A betrayal so absolute it poisoned the very foundation of their burgeoning life together, tainting every whispered vow, every shared glance, and every hopeful dream within that gilded frame. It was an offense against truth itself, a monumental falsehood that would echo through generations, leaving a trail of wreckage in its wake. When the insidious tendrils of that truth eventually uncoiled, slithering into the stark light of day and tearing through the delicate fabric of polite society like a rampant wildfire, the initial response was, as one might anticipate, a dizzying maelstrom of shock and disbelief. Gasps rippled through the tightly knit community, followed by a deluge of incredulous whispers and a profound sense of outrage that threatened to shatter every established decorum. Reputations, once thought impregnable, began to fray at the edges. Yet amidst this storm of public condemnation and private devastation, my own reaction was met with a degree of bewilderment, even concern. There was no dramatic collapse, no public display of hysterical grief, no torrent of tears to punctuate the raw pain. Instead, an almost unnerving stillness settled over me, a quietude that seemed to defy the very gravity of the situation. This was not the vacant stare of shock, nor the numbing embrace of despair. It was something far more deliberate, a strategic calm born not of indifference, but of an icy, unwavering resolve that had been forged in the crucible of a slow-burning realization. In an era where a woman's emotional vulnerability was often her most public and expected display, where the strictures of Victorian society dictated a certain fragility in the face of such profound personal betrayal, my quietude was an act of profound, almost rebellious defiance. It was a conscious refusal to grant the perpetrator the satisfaction of witnessing my public unraveling, a silent declaration that my spirit, though wounded, remained unbroken. Behind the placid exterior, a tempest of understanding raged, certainly, but it was a controlled, directed storm. Every fiber of my being, every shard of my shattered hope, was being channeled into a singular, focused determination. This calm served as a formidable shield, yes, but it was also a powerful crucible, silently forging a strength that few, especially in the restrictive year of 1895, would ever have anticipated from a woman in my position. It was the quiet before a different kind of storm, one I intended to guide with a precision born of bitter experience and a newly awakened sense of purpose. The world believed it saw a victim, but I knew with chilling clarity that it was merely witnessing the gestation of a formidable force. The world, for a brief, glorious interlude, seemed to hold its collective breath, poised on the precipice of an irreversible shift. The polished veneer of that wedding photograph, once an impenetrable fortress of societal respectability and unassailable charm, would soon begin its inevitable, agonizing crack, steadily revealing the insidious rot that festered beneath its perfect surface. Justice, that elusive and often ponderous mistress, though still moving with the deliberate pace of the era, was already stirring, a nascent, almost imperceptible tremor beneath the carefully manicured lawns of polite society. It began subtly, so subtly that only the most astute observers, or those already predisposed to suspicion, could detect it. There was an almost imperceptible shift in the way certain glances lingered a moment too long, a sudden, awkward silence that would inexplicably punctuate conversations whenever the groom's name was even tangentially mentioned. A fleeting moment of public doubt, an unsettling flicker of uncertainty, began to manifest in the eyes of those who had once lauded him as the very epitome of success, charm, and impeccable standing. His impeccably constructed facade, once so utterly convincing, so flawless in its presentation, now showed the first, almost invisible hairline fractures, visible only to those who knew precisely where to search, or perhaps, to those whose own deeply rooted intuition had always whispered warnings of the lurking shadows within his seemingly perfect world. These were the first tremors of an earthquake yet to strike, the initial, barely audible dissonances in a symphony of deceit that was destined for a dramatic public crescendo. The seeds of his undoing, meticulously sown by his own hand, were now beginning to sprout, pushing through the soil of his carefully cultivated lies, promising a harvest of profound consequence. Before we continue this journey through the secrets of 1895, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and share with us where you are watching from in the comments below. Your engagement helps us bring more untold stories to light. To truly grasp the magnitude of the deception hidden within that single photograph, one must first step back into the world from which it emerged, a world far removed from our own, yet bound by universal human aspirations and frailties. The year 1895 was a tapestry woven with strict social codes, where reputation was a currency more valuable than gold, and the roles for men and women were meticulously defined, leaving little room for deviation. It was an era when a woman's worth was often measured by the quality of her marriage, her life's trajectory irrevocably set by the man she chose to stand beside. Communities were small, insular ecosystems, where every triumph and every transgression echoed through parlor rooms and market squares. Gossip was not merely idle chatter. It was a potent force, capable of elevating or destroying reputations with a whisper. For young women like Clara, the pressure to secure a good match was immense, a silent, pervasive hum that underscored every social interaction, every carefully chosen dress, every polite conversation at a Sunday tea. A successful marriage was not just a personal aspiration. It was a societal imperative, a testament to her family's standing and her own perceived virtues. Clara's family, the Ashworths, were pillars of this conservative society. Respected, traditional, and deeply rooted in the community, they embodied the values of the era. Their home, a grand but unpretentious estate on the edge of town, was a hub of refined activity, their name synonymous with integrity and decorum. Perhaps in their steadfast adherence to tradition, they were also slightly naive, or perhaps overly trusting, seeing the world through the lens of their own honorable intentions. They believed in the good in people, a virtue that, in hindsight, might have been their greatest vulnerability. Then there was Arthur Sterling, the groom, a man who seemed to embody every desirable quality of the age. Tall, with an aristocratic bearing, and a smile that could disarm the most cautious observer, he was a merchant of growing success, his family's name established, if not quite as ancient as the Ashworths. His family, though outwardly respectable and well-connected, carried an air of guardedness, a subtle hint of ambition that sometimes felt less about community and more about acquisition. Arthur was, by all social standards, an exceptional catch, the kind of man whose presence at any social gathering instantly elevated its prestige. The courtship had been swift, a whirlwind of carriage rides, polite calls, and shared glances across crowded ballrooms, culminating in a proposal that seemed to fulfill every romantic ideal. Yet, even amidst the joyous flurry of wedding preparations, the seeds of discord were quietly being sown, almost imperceptibly. A fleeting remark from Clara's Aunt Eleanor, a woman known for her keen, if sometimes unsettling, observations, lingered in the air after Arthur had left one evening. She had spoken of a distant cousin's vague recollection of Arthur's earlier years, a period she described simply as unsettled, before quickly dismissing it with a wave of her hand and a forced smile. There was also Arthur's occasional, unexplained absence from social engagements, always excused with plausible, if slightly vague, explanations about business dealings in a neighboring county. Clara's closest confidant, her cousin Lily, once confessed a subtle discomfort, a feeling she couldn't quite articulate, after a particularly intense conversation with Arthur about his future plans. She'd quickly chided herself for being silly, attributing it to pre-wedding jitters, but the fleeting expression on her face had not been lost on Clara. These were not red flags waving boldly in the breeze, but rather faint whispers, easily rationalized away or drowned out by the crescendo of wedding excitement. For Clara, the initial feelings were a heady mix of excitement and profound societal validation. To be chosen by a man of Arthur's standing was to secure her future, to uphold her family's honor, and to fulfill the destiny laid out for her since birth. The grand wedding, meticulously planned to the last detail, was to be the crowning moment of her young life, a public affirmation of her place in the world. Yet, beneath the surface of this joyous anticipation, a quiet unease began to stir, a premonition she struggled desperately to articulate, even to herself. It was a faint, almost imperceptible discord in the symphony of her happiness, a persistent whisper of intuition that defied all logic and reason. She would catch herself gazing at Arthur, admiring his handsome profile, his confident demeanor, and then a flicker of something she couldn't quite name would pass through his eyes. a momentary shadow that chilled her to the bone before vanishing as quickly as it appeared. She dismissed it as nerves, as the natural anxieties of a young woman embarking on such a momentous journey. How could a man so charming, so outwardly perfect, harbor anything but the purest intentions? The thought seemed absurd, a betrayal of the trust she had placed in him, and in the careful judgment of her family. But the unease persisted, a growing, quiet hum beneath the surface of her conscience, a silent, unsettling question mark in the otherwise pristine narrative of her impending marriage. It was a premonition she could not shake, a subtle dissonance that would, in time, prove to be the most accurate compass in her life's unfolding journey. The veneer of politeness in their small insular community often masked currents far deeper and more turbulent than any casual observer might suspect. The impending union between Clara Atherton and Edward Blackwood was hailed as a perfect match, a melding of old-world grace with new-world dynamism. Yet, beneath the surface of congratulatory smiles and whispered admirations, lay a complex tapestry woven from generations of family history, old wounds, and unspoken rivalries that predated even the grandparents of the present generation. The Athertons, for instance, were pillars of the community, their names synonymous with unwavering integrity and a quiet, dignified wealth earned through generations of careful stewardship of land and judicious investments. Their roots ran deep into the very soil of the region, their reputation built not on ostentatious display, but on an inherent sense of moral rectitude and a commitment to communal welfare. In stark contrast, the Blackwoods were relative newcomers to such elevated social standing. Their fortune, though undeniably significant, had been amassed with a rapidity that raised more than a few eyebrows among the established gentry. Whispers followed their name, not of scandal, but of a certain ruthless efficiency, an almost predatory ambition that bordered on the audacious. Their patriarch, a man of formidable will and sharp intellect, had a reputation for always securing the most advantageous deal, often leaving others to count their losses in his wake. There was a lingering tale, almost a legend in the local taverns, of how a significant portion of the Blackwood estate, now so grand and imposing, had been acquired decades prior. It involved a contested land claim, a desperate widow, and a swift, decisive legal maneuver that, while perfectly within the bounds of the law, had left a sour taste in the mouths of many. It was a story often dismissed as mere gossip, yet it clung to the Blackwood name like a stubborn burr. Clara, though young and largely shielded from the harsher realities of the world, had absorbed these subtle undercurrents through the very air she breathed. She remembered her grandmother, a woman of formidable perception, once sighing softly while watching Edward's father ride past, remarking, "Some trees bear fruit, others bear thorns, and some, my dear, bear only the illusion of fruit." At the time, Clara had merely nodded, finding the comment enigmatic. Now, looking back, the words echoed with a chilling prescience. The Blackwoods, for all their outward charm and generosity, possessed a guarded nature, a tendency to keep their true intentions close to their chests. They prioritized appearances above all else, maintaining an impeccable facade that belied a deeper, almost calculating pragmatism. This was not the simple discretion of a respectable family. It was a deliberate, almost strategic opacity, honed over generations. Specific memories, once dismissed as inconsequential, began to surface in Clara's mind, each a faint red flag she had unconsciously folded away. There was the peculiar letter that had arrived at their stately home nearly a year before the engagement, addressed to her father. It was a crisp, official-looking envelope, bearing a foreign postmark. Her father had read it with a furrowed brow, then quickly burned it in the parlor fireplace, an action entirely out of character for the methodical man. When Clara, a curious 15-year-old at the time, had inquired, he merely waved it off as a misunderstanding from an overzealous solicitor. The explanation had satisfied her then, but retrospectively, it felt like a brushstroke in a larger, unsettling portrait. Then there was the unsettling story recounted by an elderly cousin, Aunt Mildred, a woman known for her sharp memory and even sharper tongue. She had spoken of Edward's elder brother, a shadowy figure rarely mentioned, who had supposedly vanished years ago under mysterious circumstances, only for the family to claim he had emigrated to the colonies for business opportunities. Aunt Mildred, however, had hinted at a more scandalous departure, a flight from debts or a broken engagement, something hushed up with considerable effort. Clara, captivated by the romance of her own impending wedding, had rationalized it away as an old woman's fanciful exaggeration, a relic of a bygone era where such misfortunes were swept under the rug. She wanted to believe in the perfect narrative presented to her. Edward himself, while undeniably captivating, possessed a certain elusive quality. His charm was undeniable, his wit quick, and his devotion to Clara seemed boundless. Yet there were moments, fleeting and almost imperceptible, when his eyes would harden, when a flicker of something cold and calculating would cross his face before he quickly masked it with a smile. Clara recalled a conversation with him about his family's business dealings. He had spoken with an almost frightening detachment about necessary sacrifices and unavoidable casualties in the pursuit of prosperity. At the time, she had admired his decisiveness, mistaking it for strength. Now the memory brought a chill. There was also the incident at the annual Harvest Festival, a seemingly minor social faux pas that had gnawed at her. Edward had been overheard making a disparaging remark about the financial struggles of a neighboring farmer, a man whose family had been tenants on Atherton land for generations. He had laughed, a short, sharp sound, and dismissed the farmer's plight as a consequence of poor planning and lack of foresight. Clara had felt a sudden, inexplicable pang of discomfort, a fleeting sense of alienation from the man she was promised to marry. She had brushed it aside, attributing it to his youthful exuberance and perhaps a misunderstanding of rural complexities. How desperately she had wished to see only the best in him, to believe in the fairy tale that society had so carefully constructed around her engagement. The gradual erosion of trust, therefore, was not a sudden cataclysm, but a slow, almost imperceptible process, like water wearing away stone. Each small crack, each subtle red flag, was either ignored, rationalized, or buried beneath the overwhelming societal pressure to maintain the illusion of a perfect match. The desire for a grand wedding, the validation it brought, and the fear of social censure for questioning such an advantageous union, all conspired to blind Clara and her family to the accumulating evidence. They were caught in a gilded cage of expectations, where the truth, however unsettling, was far less appealing than the comfortable lie. The unspoken anxieties festered, growing stronger with each dismissed intuition, each rationalized discrepancy. The foundation of the union, far from being solid rock, was built on shifting sand, held together by the thin, fragile threads of hope and willful ignorance. The stage was set, not for a blissful marriage, but for a revelation that would shatter the very fabric of their carefully constructed world. The courtship, viewed through the prism of hindsight, was a masterclass in calculated deception. Edward, initially so attentive and seemingly devoted, revealed a pattern of subtle manipulation, each instance carefully masked beneath a veneer of charm and plausible excuses. These weren't grand betrayals, but rather a series of small episodes that, like pinpricks to a balloon, slowly deflated Clara's perception of him and her own self-worth. He had promised her a lavish trip to the coast after their engagement, a chance to escape the stifling confines of their small town and revel in the freedom of the ocean air. Clara, who had rarely ventured beyond the familiar landscapes of her home, had envisioned romantic strolls along the beach, candlelit dinners under the stars, and whispered promises of a shared future. The trip, however, was repeatedly postponed. First, it was a pressing business matter that demanded his immediate attention. Then, it was a sudden illness in his family, requiring him to stay close to home. Each time, he offered profuse apologies, showering her with flowers and trinkets to compensate for the disappointment. Clara, eager to believe in his sincerity, accepted his excuses without question, convinced that circumstances beyond his control were to blame. But a nagging doubt lingered, a sense that something wasn't quite right. The promised trip, once a symbol of their blossoming love, became a recurring reminder of broken promises and unfulfilled expectations. Another instance involved his claims of wealth and influence. He spoke often of his family's vast holdings and their prominent position in society, painting a picture of a life of unparalleled luxury and privilege that awaited her as his wife. He hinted at lucrative investments and whispered of powerful connections, creating an illusion of financial security that seemed almost too good to be true. Yet, when Clara subtly inquired about specific details, his answers became vague and evasive. He would deflect her questions with a joke or change the subject altogether, leaving her with a growing sense of unease. She noticed that he was always careful to avoid discussing specifics about his assets or business dealings. Once, during a casual conversation with a local merchant, Clara mentioned Edward's supposed involvement in a major shipping venture. The merchant, a man known for his honesty and integrity, raised an eyebrow and politely corrected her, stating that Edward's family had divested their interests in shipping several years prior. The incident was small, almost insignificant, but it planted a seed of doubt in Clara's mind, a suspicion that Edward was not being entirely truthful about his financial status. The manipulation extended beyond material possessions and promises. Edward possessed a remarkable ability to subtly undermine Clara's confidence and make her question her own judgment. He would offer what seemed like constructive criticism, pointing out flaws in her appearance, her opinions, or her social skills. These criticisms were always delivered with a tone of gentle concern, masked as a genuine desire to help her improve. He would comment on her choice of clothing, suggesting that certain styles were not flattering to her figure. He would dismiss her opinions on political matters as naive or uninformed. He would subtly ridicule her social awkwardness, making her feel self-conscious and inadequate in social gatherings. Slowly, insidiously, he eroded her self-esteem, making her increasingly dependent on his approval and validation. She began to second-guess her own instincts, relying on Edward's guidance to navigate the complexities of social life. The once independent and self-assured Clara was gradually transformed into a shadow of her former self, her spirit dimmed by Edward's constant criticisms and subtle manipulations. Even her relationships with her family and friends began to suffer. Edward would subtly sow seeds of discord, making disparaging remarks about her loved ones and creating an atmosphere of tension and distrust. He would criticize her sister's choice of husband, questioning his ambition and financial prospects. He would dismiss her best friend as frivolous and unreliable. He would subtly manipulate conversations to create misunderstandings and resentment between Clara and her family, isolating her from her support network and making her increasingly reliant on him. The once close bonds that had sustained her throughout her life began to fray, leaving her feeling alone and vulnerable. The slow corrosion of trust was a gradual, insidious process, a relentless chipping away at Clara's emotional well-being. Each broken promise, each subtle manipulation, each dismissive gesture served to weaken her resolve and erode her sense of self. She found herself trapped in a relationship that felt increasingly hollow and unsettling, bound by societal expectations and the fear of social ostracism. The joy and excitement that had once filled her heart were replaced by a gnawing sense of unease, a feeling that she was slowly losing herself in a web of deceit and manipulation. The wedding, once a symbol of hope and happiness, now loomed as a dark and ominous cloud on the horizon, a testament to the devastating power of broken promises and the slow, insidious corrosion of trust. The weeks leading up to the wedding became a crucible for Clara, forging an unbearable pressure that threatened to crush her spirit entirely. The subtle discomforts and fleeting suspicions that had once been dismissed as mere nerves or girlish fancy now coalesced into a palpable, menacing presence. Family discussions, once filled with joyous plans for floral arrangements and guest lists, now frequently devolved into strained silences and hushed arguments. Her Aunt Mildred, a woman of sharp wit and even sharper intuition, grew increasingly vocal in her misgivings about Edward. She would corner Clara in the parlor, her eyes filled with a concern that bordered on alarm, citing vague anecdotes about Edward's past acquaintances or unusual business dealings that seemed to materialize from the ether. "There's a certain glint in his eye, dear," she'd murmur, "that speaks of calculation, not devotion." Clara's mother, however, remained steadfast in her commitment to the match, her own anxieties buried beneath a rigid adherence to social propriety. "Mildred, you'll upset the girl," she would chide, her voice tight with a mixture of exasperation and fear. "Edward is a fine catch, and the wedding will proceed as planned. We cannot allow idle gossip to ruin such a splendid union." The very air in their grand home grew thick with unspoken tension, a fragile peace maintained only by the sheer force of her parents' will to uphold appearances. Edward himself seemed to respond to the escalating pressure with a heightened, almost frantic energy. His charm, once so effortless, now felt a touch forced, his smiles a fraction too wide. He became more possessive, his letters to Clara filled with an insistent longing that, rather than comforting her, only amplified her sense of being trapped. He began to subtly undermine her family's concerns, painting Aunt Mildred as an overly dramatic spinster, and dismissing her father's cautious inquiries into his financial ventures as an insult to his honor. Clara, caught between the two immovable forces of her family's hopes and her own burgeoning dread, found herself retreating further into silence. Every gesture, every word, every interaction became fraught with a hidden meaning she desperately tried to decipher. Beyond the confines of their home, the community's gaze intensified, transforming from benign interest into a dissecting scrutiny. In a town where reputation was currency and gossip traveled faster than the telegraph, the slightest tremor in the social fabric was felt by all. Whispers, like tendrils of smoke, began to curl around the edges of their impending celebration. They started subtly, a raised eyebrow at the weekly church service, a pause in conversation as Clara passed by in the market square. Soon these became more direct. Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, would offer Clara a sympathetic, knowing glance while wrapping her bread, a look that spoke volumes without a single word. Young ladies, once eager to congratulate her, now offered hesitant, almost pitying smiles. The nature of the rumors remained vague, a nebulous cloud of suspicion surrounding Edward's past, his sudden wealth, or the true circumstances of his family's move to their town. Some spoke of a mysterious woman in a distant city, others of a business deal that had left partners destitute. None dared to speak these allegations directly to Clara, but their unspoken presence was a constant, suffocating weight. The pressure mounted not only from the overt inquiries, but from the insidious, silent judgments that permeated every social interaction. At tea parties, conversations would abruptly shift as Clara entered the room. Her cousins, usually boisterous and open, grew quiet and watchful in her presence, their expressions a mixture of concern and awkwardness. She felt as though she were constantly being observed, her every move interpreted, her every forced smile scrutinized. The once joyful anticipation of her wedding, a day she had dreamed of since childhood, transformed into a heavy, suffocating burden. It was no longer a celebration of love, but a public performance, a meticulous upholding of a facade that felt increasingly brittle. The entire town, it seemed, was waiting, watching, for the inevitable crack to appear. This suffocating psychological environment began to take a severe toll on Clara. Sleep became a luxury she rarely afforded, her nights plagued by restless thoughts and vivid, unsettling dreams. She would wake in the pre-dawn hours, her heart pounding, a cold sweat dampening her nightgown, the phantom sensation of being trapped closing in around her. Her appetite vanished, and her once vibrant complexion grew pale, her eyes shadowed with a profound weariness. She felt isolated, despite being surrounded by family and friends. Every attempt to voice her growing dread was met with either a dismissive platitude or a stern reminder of her duties and the importance of her family's standing. Her mother, desperate to maintain control, would often say, "Clara, you are imagining things. You must be strong for Edward, for us. Think of the scandal if you falter now." The home environment, once a sanctuary of warmth and affection, morphed into a place of unspoken anxiety and tension. Laughter felt forced, conversations superficial, and every silence seemed to hum with unaddressed fears. Clara found herself spending hours alone in her room, staring out the window, watching the world outside move on while she felt suspended in a terrifying stasis. The beautiful gown, hanging pristine in her wardrobe, once a symbol of hope and new beginnings, now seemed like a shroud, a garment for a sacrifice rather than a celebration. She was a bird in a gilded cage, the bars of expectation and societal decree tightening around her with each passing day. The dread that had been a whisper was now a roar, and Clara, despite her forced composure, knew deep in her heart that something truly catastrophic was looming. The wedding day approached, not as a beacon of joy, but as an inescapable appointment with a truth she was terrified to face, a truth that promised to unravel everything she had ever known. She felt utterly alone, navigating a treacherous path where every step brought her closer to an abyss. The weight of the world, it seemed, rested squarely on her slender shoulders, a burden far too immense for any young woman to bear. Each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall echoed like a hammer blow, counting down the precious moments until her fate, inextricably linked to Edward's, would be sealed. Her hands, once busy with embroidery or piano practice, now often lay idle in her lap, trembling slightly, betraying the calm she so desperately tried to project. A constant knot tightened in her stomach, a physical manifestation of the emotional turmoil raging within. She yearned for a confidant, someone who could truly understand the terrifying premonition that gnawed at her. But her pleas for genuine understanding were met with either well-meaning, but ultimately unhelpful advice, or outright dismissal. The very air she breathed felt heavy, thick with the unspoken, the unacknowledged, and the dread of what lay just beyond the horizon. She was walking towards a precipice, blindfolded by tradition and pushed forward by the irresistible force of societal expectation. As the wedding preparations reached fever pitch, Edward grew increasingly reckless. Perhaps it was the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable, or maybe the mounting pressure finally cracked high.